Alright, I have a challenge for you. In this file that you see on my screen, I've drawn this abstract shape, and I've drawn it using all of the same skills that we've just learned in the first few lessons that you've already watched. And so you technically have all the skills you need to be able to build this. But it is a little bit on the difficult side, so there's going to be some struggle. You might not be able to finish it. And that's okay. So this is a perfect opportunity to take what you've learned so far and try to put it to practice. Find out where you're having issues, where you're having questions. Now, if you breeze through this, you make this object no problem, great. Then you're ready to just keep cruising. If you struggle through this, it might be a sign that you want to review a few of the lessons. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to build this object right next to this one for you. So this would be a great time to pause the video and try to make this on your own. So you'll notice I'm just kind of orbiting around to give you a sense of what this object is. So a good idea to try out your own strategies. And I suggest, even if you're struggling, you try a few different approaches. It's going to help make what you've learned so far stick. Now that being said, whether you've tried this and succeeded, tried it and failed, or landed somewhere in between, let's go ahead and build it together. So I want you now to follow along with me. You can start a new file, or you can build alongside whatever it is that you built. I'll go ahead and build alongside so we can use this original one for reference. So what I'll do is I'll show you the way that I did this, showing a few options along the way, but in general, one of the better ways to build this. So first, I suggest starting with the rectangle tool. Press R for the rectangle tool, and drawing a rectangle on the ground for the bottom shape here. Then press P for push-pull, and click to push-pull up the original box. Now at this point, it could be a little bit confusing as to how would you get these kinds of sloping, almost roof-like shape coming from here. Well, one thing I happen to know, if I orbit over the top of this original shape, now remember I have perspective turned on, so it'll be a little strange looking. This shape that's coming up from the bottom shape is centered. So in order to get a centered start to this, I use the offset tool, press F for offset, hover over that top surface and hover with your mouse close to an edge but not on an edge. Click, then move the mouse in, and you're offsetting 4 edges there. I'll click somewhere in the middle there. Now I know I have a perfectly offset rectangle there, centered on the original rectangle. Now for some, don't do this, but I'll just mention it. For some, I'll notice that the tendency here is to press P for push-pull this box up, and then perhaps use L for the line tool, so press L for the line tool. Again, don't follow along with this because this isn't my recommended way, just mentioning different ways to go about it. You could trace from corner endpoint to corner endpoint, hit escape on your keyboard to let go of that rubber band line, then go from corner endpoint to corner endpoint. You notice you can start to get these surfaces to fill in around. But the problem with that approach is that you're going to leave behind a bunch of extra geometry inside, and it's a little bit more of a time-consuming thing to do. So I'll go ahead and undo back to before that push-pull. Now here's something that most people wouldn't know is an option. So this is something that pretty much no matter how much success you had, you might learn something here. So take a look. Press M for the Move tool. And with the Move tool, hover over that center surface. Remember, if some surface is already highlighted, you'll need to right-click in white space to deselect everything. Then move your Move tool cursor on top of that face. You should see that face actively highlight. Now I want you to try to click, let go of your mouse, and move up in the blue direction. And when I say up in the blue direction, you might say, well, I'm moving my cursor up, but I don't understand what you're talking about. Well, this is moving off into the distance. It's not moving up in the blue direction, like vertically. So what this amounts to is, remember from one of our previous lessons, we're being restricted in where we can move this shape. And that restriction with the Move tool has to do with autofold. So if you look down at the bottom left corner of your screen, if you're on a Mac, it'll say Command equals autofold. This is just a reminder. If you're on a PC, it'll say Control equals autofold. So go ahead and press that key on your keyboard, and now try to move your cursor up in the blue direction, and you'll notice what happens. So I'll go ahead and click to set this down once I've moved it up in the blue direction. SketchUp automatically created those auto fold lines, so lines at all four sides, so that it could pop this piece up. So think of this like origami. It made some folds, and you could sort of pop this shape up now. So that's a much more efficient, quick way to do that, and you haven't left behind any geometry inside. Okay, next up, press P for push-pull. Hover over that top surface. Click to begin push-pulling, and I recommend that we push-pull it not to the higher height of this side of things, but sort of to the lower height of this side of things. Now, I'm not going to match it perfectly here. I just want to eyeball it. I mentioned that we don't eyeball things, but here I'm not actually trying to match these perfectly, so it's okay that I'm just roughly doing it. Okay, the next thing that you might be thinking of doing here is you see an arc is to use one of the arc tools, perhaps the 2-point arc tool, to draw in the arc here. But I happen to know that this arc was centered. And what I mean by centered is this distance here, this horizontal distance, is the exact same as this horizontal distance. So before these things got sort of put on different heights, this arc shape was centered here. So to me, a really easy way to get a centered arc shape would actually be to start with the circle tool. So press C for circle tool. Hover along this edge until you find its midpoint. And then be sure you've got it where you've got the midpoint and it's in the green direction, because if you have your cursor a little bit this way, just notice subtle nudges make it still on the midpoint, but it's green, versus still on the midpoint, but it's blue. Blue is the wrong direction here. We want to draw vertically, so that's green. Make sure you have the green direction. Click, and then move your mouse down, and click somewhere where you have that circle to the inside, so it's not coming to the outside of things. Then we don't need the top half of the circle, so press E for the eraser tool, and then erase away that top edge. Because geometry gets merged up here in SketchUp, you only lose half the circle and you keep the other half, which ends up just being a centered arc. Now next up, press P for push-pull. Hover over this surface here, this flat surface. Click to begin push-pulling it through. You're going to carve it away. And remember that if you hover over that back surface, so you actually push-pull through till you have those two parallel surfaces overlapping each other, click to finish, and it will carve it or cancel it out. Okay, the last step is to get this side up. So one of the common mistakes, so don't do this, but one of the common mistakes I'll see here is to take the push-pull tool and go up with it. And it's not a bad idea, but you'll notice that I've got now a vertical face there on the inside rather than a hooking sort of J face there. So that's not quite right. So in the middle of this, I'll hit the escape key on my keyboard to let that go, let that operation in progress go. Now another thing you could try, press M for the move tool. This won't be right either, but it's still a slightly better approach than the previous one. So with the move tool, if you hover over that top face and you click to move up, and you move up in the blue direction, or you try to move up in the blue direction, at first it seems like it's doing the trick. But if you notice, on my original one, this face here is perfectly vertical, whereas as I move this one up, notice that that face is slanting over to the right, or if I were to move it down, it's slanting over to the left. So the move tool, the way it's kind of having things go, is it's actually kind of messing up that outside wall so that it's not perfectly vertical. So I'll hit escape. That's not quite right either. So what is there left to do? Well, this is sort of a trick question because this is something we haven't talked about yet, but it's a concept I want to highlight, which is, first, let's take the push-pull tool. Press P for push-pull and hover over this top surface. Now, you might think, okay, we already know the push-pull doesn't work. And so then the next thing with any tool, when it's not working out of the box, is to ask yourself, is there a keyboard shortcut I could be using to change its behavior? So those keyboard shortcuts are down at the bottom left. Now in this case, I happen to know that this keyboard shortcut here for create new starting face, that's not the right one for us. We'll talk about that feature later. So it turns out it's not telling us there is no keyboard shortcut that we can use here. But every once in a while, and this is one of these rare instances, especially here with this example in the push-pull tool, you won't be reminded of a key that you could press. But here's the thing, rather than relying on what keys it tells you to press, you always know that you have a few potential key modifiers, and you may as well experiment with them just to see what happens. So on a Mac, we know that we can use the Command key and we can use the Option key on our keyboard, and that will often change the behavior. And on a PC, that's the Control key or the Alt key. So when we're thinking about what we could be doing here, we could try the Alt key on a PC and the Command key on a Mac. So hold down the Command key on a Mac or the Alt key on a PC, click to begin push-pulling while you're holding that key down, and then push-pull it up, and you'll notice what you're doing. It's kind of like what was happening with the Move tool, but it's keeping that vertical outside face with the push-pull. Let's go ahead and click to set that down. So the idea here is that I wouldn't expect you to know that. We didn't cover that exact keyboard shortcut with the push-pull. But in SketchUp, it can be very easy to decide, oh, the tool out of the box doesn't seem to do what I want, and then sort of give up from there. Or if you're thinking a little bit better, you might try to remind yourself by looking at keys down in the bottom left, which is a great step. But the real thing that you should be doing is just being really comfortable using either of your keyboard modifiers with any tool and just saying, let's see what happens. Worst case scenario, if you make a mistake, you can always undo back a step. And the more quickly you feel comfortable to make mistakes and try things out, the faster you'll get at memorizing and not even thinking about what keys to press with which tools to get the results you want. So that would be the way I'd recommend trying to replicate the shape with as few steps as possible. But of course, there are many ways to get to this same object. And however you got here, congratulations. And let's get on to the next lessons where we'll build on this with creating some more recognizable stuff in 3D.